Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the show where we really get into complex topics, pull out the key insights, and tailor it all just for you. Today, we're plunging into something pretty remarkable. China's really ambitious Thousand Startups Bloom strategy. Our mission here in this deep dive is to unpack how China kicked off this innovation boom, look at the outcomes, which were often pretty dramatic, and figure out what this unique approach means for, the global economy. We've dug into a whole stack of sources for this economic analyses, industry reports, some historical context. It's a genuinely fascinating story. So let's jump right in.
All right, so this unique innovation story in China. To really get it, we kind of need to go back to the beginning, right? What was the spark? Where did this whole Thousand Startups Bloom idea actually come from?
Right. Well, the genesis, the beginning of this strategy, often called mass entrepreneurship and innovation. In China, it really started taking shape in the late 2000s, maybe early 2010s.
Yep.
China was, frankly, scrambling. They needed new ways to grow. After the 2008 global financial crisis, their old model, relying so heavily on manufacturing and exports, just wasn't sustainable anymore. I mean, a lot of exporters actually went bankrupt around then. So they really needed something new.
Okay, so a crisis often leads to change. What was the specific response?
Well, in 2010, the government identified these things they called strategic emerging industries. Think biotech, new energy, advanced manufacturing. Key sectors they wanted to build up through innovation. But the real pivotal moment, the big signal, came in September 2014. Premier Li Keqiang at the Summer Davos Forum made this call for mass entrepreneurship and innovation. Dazhong Chuanxie, Wanong Chuanxie. And this wasn't just talk. It was a signal for a huge nationwide campaign, right from the top.
Okay, a nationwide campaign. But what did that actually look like on the ground for, someone actually trying to start a business? Lots of top-down direction, sure, but the practical side.
Oh, it was incredibly extensive, a really concerted push. After 2014, the government rolled out this just an incredible array of measures. They made registering a business way easier, offered pretty big tax breaks, and crucially, made it easier to go funding. They even allowed things like pension funds, state banks to invest directly into venture capital. And you saw hundreds of new incubators and tech parks popping up everywhere, often backed by government money alongside private capital.
Yeah.
Get this. In just 2.5 years after the initiative started, central and local governments put out over 400 new policies and regulations to support it.
400, wow.
Yeah. And the impact, it was immediate, dramatic. New business registrations in China just shot through the roof, tripled in about 6 years. Yeah, an astonishing surge. And by the late 2010s, China was suddenly number 2, right behind the U.S., in tech unicorns, those billion-dollar startups. It was all very deliberate, a strategic shift for China's new normal of slower traditional growth, harnessing mass creativity, pivoting to innovation, kind of echoes Mao's old 100 Flowers idea, but for startups. And what's really fascinating here is the thinking behind it, this Thousand Startups Bloom thing. It wasn't just random. It was rooted in both economic and geopolitical strategy, very different from how most countries do it.
That's what I was thinking. Usually countries try to pick the winner, right? Put all their support behind one or two potentials. But China seemed to say, let's back hundreds. Why? Why this sort of scattergun approach?
Exactly. It's like bet hedging on a massive scale. In these new tech fields, EVs, AI, whatever, nobody really knows for sure which specific technology or business model is going to win out in the end. So by seeding dozens, sometimes hundreds of startups at the same time, often with state cash, China just dramatically boosts the odds that at least a few will become genuine world-class leaders. Instead of predicting the winner, the state kind of picks the winner by picking many. They let the market sort it out mostly. The government just, fertilizes the whole field with subsidies, grants, cheap loans, then lets competition do the pruning.
So it's a mix then, top-down goals, but bottom-up fighting it out.
Precisely. You get top-down guidance like, we need to lead in EVs, but then intense bottom-up competition. They give initial resources to maybe hundreds of firms. Then they just let them battle it out. And China's huge domestic market, over 1.4 billion people, gives them the space for all this experimentation and scaling. It's been called a state-led funding approach, really focused on getting things commercialized fast, scaling up with government backing. Very different from the U.S. model, which relies mostly on private VC. The whole point is to accelerate development, especially where China started behind, just taking more shots on goal, essentially.
And presumably the goal is also to end up with some big, globally competitive companies, national champions.
Absolutely. That's a core strategic aim. Get a few of these startups to grow into national champions that can compete worldwide and, crucially, cut down reliance on foreign tech. Plus, by fostering so many companies, even the failures contribute. They build up the whole domestic supply chain, the talent pool, Think about all the engineers trained. It's like planting a forest, right? Most little trees won't make it, but the few strong ones that do become the backbone of the industry. Like in batteries, they supported so many players, they ended up building the whole ecosystem, from mining materials to final assembly. Self-reliance.
And the speed aspect, it seems like things happen incredibly fast there. Speed and scale, that's the other key part. They unleash this flood of capital and startups to build industrial capacity at a pace that often leaves Western competitors just standing still. We saw it in solar, we saw it in EVs, and yes, that means tolerating short-term redundancy, inefficiency, what looks like wasted money from a purely financial view. But they see it as the price you pay for long-term dominance. It's definitely a high-variance strategy. You accept a lot of failures, hoping for a few enormous successes.
Okay, so it's this really interesting mix, like socialist planning meets capitalist competition, using top-down power to fuel bottom-up energy. Sounds powerful on paper, but how did it actually work out when the rubber hit the road in specific industries?
Right, so we have the strategy. Now I'm really keen to see how it played out. And I've heard the EV story. That sounds like a textbook case, maybe even a bit wild.
Oh, it absolutely is. A textbook case, and definitely wild. Around 2014, 2015, China decided EVs, particularly battery electric cars, were strategic. A chance to leapfrog the traditional automakers. So they rolled out the red carpet, huge subsidies, tax breaks, incentives for production, anything to kickstart a homegrown EV industry. And the result? An explosion. By 2018, 2019, you had something like 500 registered new energy vehicle manufacturers. 500.
500 companies, seriously.
Seriously. Ranging from genuinely innovative tech companies to, well, some shell companies just trying to get subsidy money. The strategy was clearly let everyone have a go, use subsidies to create demand, and then let the market sort them out.
Okay, but that sounds like a bubble waiting to burst. What happened next?
Exactly. The shakeout started properly around 2020. Beijing began phasing out those massive subsidies. They'd spent something like $14 billion over the decade. At the same time, you had giants like BYD, which had benefited from early state support, and even foreign players like Tesla, who were actually invited in to spur competition. They started a brutal price war, and that just squeezed the smaller, weaker startups. If you didn't have strong tech or enough scale, you were in trouble. Many just folded.
A brutal culling, sounds like. Was there pushback, or was it just accepted as Darwinism, Chinese style? And what did the numbers look like after the dust settled?
Well, the Darwinian logic definitely took over, combined with policy shifts. That number, 500 EV makers, it plummeted, down to roughly 100 active ones by 2023. And analysts think it'll keep shrinking. Maybe only 25 to 50 brands will survive long-term by 2030. We saw some big names go under, like WM Motor, Human Horizons. They basically ceased operations in 2024.
Wow, so a huge number of failures. But did the strategy work overall? Did they get the industry they wanted?
Yes and no. I mean, it undeniably jump-started a massive industry from almost nothing. By 2023, China was making over 6 million battery EVs a year, more than half the global total. And their companies built up really strong domestic supply chains for batteries, motors, all the key stuff. But here's the massive trade-off. Huge overcapacity. I mean, back in 2020, reports suggested the entire Chinese EV industry was running at only 5% of its potential manufacturing capacity. 5%.
5%. So factories just sitting empty.
Exactly. Acres of idle factories.
Yeah.
The government sort of tolerated this at first.
Yeah.
They prioritized getting scale, getting down the learning curve, more than short-term profit. Then later, as the market matured, the regulators stepped in. They raised the technical standards, the capital requirements, making it harder for the smaller, weaker players to survive, encouraging consolidation.
Yeah.
So only the strongest really made it through BYD, NIO, XPeng, Li Auto, those types.
So it wasn't just about spending money. It was about weaponizing oversupply, create a glut, force prices down, kill off the weak, and in the process, dominate the global market and supply chain, even if it meant huge internal waste.
Yeah.
Quite a strategy. Ruthless.
Okay, let's switch gears to AI, another huge strategic area for China. Did they use a similar many startups approach there, or was it different because it's more software focused?
Very similar blueprint, yes, but adapted for software. China launched its new generation AI development plan back in 2017. Super ambitious goals, aiming for global AI leadership by 2030. And they explicitly encouraged AI entrepreneurship. Now, AI startups, unlike car factories, often need less upfront capital. It's more about algorithms, data. So the boom was fueled by tons of venture capital, a lot of it state-influenced, plus China's massive pools of user data.
Right, the data advantage. How many AI startups were we talking about? By the end of 2019, China had over 1,000 active AI companies. More than a fifth of all AI startups globally at that point. They were doing everything. Computer vision, SenseTime, Megzvi, Yitu, CloudWalk all started in the early to mid-2010s speech recognition, like iFlyTech, and just loads of companies applying AI in different sectors. And the government was pouring fuel on the fire, setting up AI research parks, innovation zones with subsidies, tax breaks, directing state-guided VC funds into AI. They also designated national AI champions in key areas, like SenseTime was picked for computer vision, Baidu for self-driving cars. Plus, crucially, they had a relatively, let's say, relaxed regulatory environment around data use back then. Combine that with China's huge population, it became this testing ground of unparalleled scale. Mountains of data to train AI on, with fewer privacy hurdles than in the West. So a massive ecosystem emerged very quickly then. Absolutely. Second only to the US by the late 2010s. Chinese AI firms were attracting huge investment, nearly $10 billion in 2020 alone, maybe a quarter of global AI startup funding that year. Lots of them became unicorns. SenseTime was valued over $7 billion at one point. The computer vision race was a classic example. You had SenseTime, Megzvi, Yitu, CloudWalk all competing fiercely, all backed to some extent. Eventually, SenseTime and Megzvi kind of pulled ahead, and the others struggled a bit more. By backing multiple horses, China ensured it had strong global players in that key AI field.
Okay, so the same logic. Lots of players initially, but you said it was maybe less of a brutal shakeout than in EVs, more of a gentle filtering?
That's a good way to describe it, yeah. Less evidence of a widespread sudden collapse like in EVs. Part of that is just the nature of software. Startups can pivot easier, get acquired, they don't leave empty factories behind, but make no mistake, weaker AI firms did quietly fold or get absorbed. And the government also started to curate the field more actively, forming AI national teams, steering capital to preferred companies, and look at 2023 with generative AI exploding. Suddenly, dozens of new Chinese Gen AI startups appeared, often with local government or state bank backing. We'll likely see the same cycle. Initial frenzy, then competition and state filtering narrows it down to a few leaders who get ongoing support.
What about the downsides? All that duplication.
Oh, definitely duplication. Countless startups doing similar AI camera analytics, for example. But Chinese policymakers seem okay with that in the early stages. They often deliberately fund multiple teams to solve the same problem, assuming the best will win out. It's different from the West, where VCs usually try to pick one or two leaders in a niche early on. The Chinese system kind of lowered the bar to entry. If you had a credible team in a strategic AI area, you could probably get some seed funding, more shots on goal, like we said. And it produced results. By 2021, China was apparently publishing half the world's AI research papers and patent filings. Shows the rapid progress this model can drive.
Okay, now for the really tough one. Semiconductors. The heart of tech. This sounds like it was incredibly ambitious, but also maybe hit some serious roadblocks.
It truly was, and yes, very fraught. Semiconductors are obviously a top priority for China, given their long dependence on foreign chips. So they applied the same playbook. Fund lots, hope some succeed. This effort really ramped up after the Made in China 2025 plan flagged chips as critical, and then it went into overdrive with the U.S. export sanctions starting around 2018. That really lit a fire under them.
So they threw money at it.
Massive amounts. China's National IC Investment Fund, the big fund, plus various provincial funds, just unleashed tens of billions of dollars. And the result was, startling proliferation. The number of registered Chinese chip design firms nearly doubled in just 2 years, hitting almost 1,800 by 2017. Then around 2020, it just went nuts. Tens of thousands of new companies registered with semiconductor in their business scope in 2020 and 2021 alone.
Tens of thousands.
Yeah. Now, admittedly, a lot of these are probably small outfits, maybe opportunistic plays for subsidies. You even had reports of real estate firms rebranding as chip companies.
Yeah.
But it showed this feverish boom, basically a chip bubble, fueled by tax breaks, land deals, easy money for anything chip related.
Okay, that definitely sounds like a bubble. Did it pop?
Oh, big time. Because designing and making advanced chips is incredibly hard. It needs deep expertise, massive R&D, specialized talent, not just cash.
Yeah.
So by 2021, 2022, as some of the easy money may be tightened up, reality bit hard. Thousands of these new firms started failing. One report estimated around 10,000 Chinese chip companies shut down in 2021, 2022.
10,000 failures.
Yeah. Many were probably just paper companies anyway,
Yeah.
or making basic, undifferentiated stuff that couldn't compete once things got serious.
So a huge number of seeds planted, very few actually grew into strong trees. Were there any upsides to that whole chaotic ship rush? Did anything meaningful come out of it?
Well, the Darwinian mechanism, as you called it, did have some effect. Despite all the failures, China's domestic chip design industry did grow significantly overall. Companies like SMIC, the big foundry, expanded their capacity. And a group of viable homegrown fabless chip designers did emerge or strengthen, like Silicon, Huawei's ARM, they're hit by sanctions, Unisoc, Yanks of memory technologies in flash memory. So while many failed, the survivors often picked up talent, maybe some IP from the ones that went under. It gradually strengthened the remaining players.
So it's like a two-stage thing again. Flood the field, then prune and focus.
Exactly. Stage 1, flood the field with state money and encouragement. Stage 2, apply pressure, let the weak fail, and then concentrate resources on the promising ones. Like SMEX getting that $2 billion capital injection in 2020, that's stage 2.
But the big question, did it work? I mean, are they catching up where it really matters at the cutting edge?
That's the $1 million or maybe $1 billion question.
Yeah.
The results are really mixed. On the plus side, China definitely has a bigger pool of semiconductor engineers now, more domestic IP, more capacity in older, mature chip segments.
Yeah.
But the downside is massive inefficiency, wasted capital, billions lost on failed projects. And crucially, despite this huge push, China still lags significantly at the cutting edge. They can't yet mass-produce the most advanced logic chips, like 5mm or 3mm nodes. It really suggests that just throwing quantity money and startups at a problem like advanced semiconductors has its limits if you lack the fundamental deep R&D breakthroughs and experience. Quality matters immensely here.
Right. But despite those limitations and the huge cost, Beijing seems to be just doubling down, aren't they? Which is quite different from how the West tackles this.
Absolutely. In 2023, they launched a new $47.5 billion Big Fund 2 focused on chips. Shows they still believe that enough investment and enough players will eventually close the gap. And yeah, it contrasts sharply with the West. Historically, the US and EU relied on a few established giants and targeted R&D. Only recently, with things like the Qi Act, are they starting to mimic China's broader incentive approach, but still funding far, far fewer companies.
Okay, let's look at renewable energy, solar, wind, batteries. This feels like an area where China's many flowers bloom strategy has been around longer and maybe more successful, though perhaps with its own drama.
Yes, this is probably the sector where the strategy has had its most demonstrably clear success, I'd say. Let's take solar panels. Back in the 2000s, China poured subsidies into solar manufacturing. Dozens of companies jumped in. By the early 2010s, their production capacity hugely outstripped global demand. Result: panel prices crashed down something like 80%, triggered a vicious price war. A lot of companies went bust. Remember Suntech Power? Once the world's biggest went bankrupt in 2013. Why? Enormous oversupply.
So chaos and bankruptcies. But what was the end result?
The end result was that the survivors companies like Trina, Yingli, JA Solar emerged much stronger. And China achieved this absolutely unassailable global lead in solar manufacturing. By the mid-2010s, they controlled maybe 80% of global production. So the strategy, despite the messiness, ultimately worked. It made solar power way cheaper for everyone globally and cemented China's dominance in the supply chain.
And are they still doing this? Is the cycle repeating?
It seems so. Fast forward to the 2020s. President Xi Jinping's climate goals sparked another wave of frenzy in solar investment. By 2023-2024, reports suggested China's solar manufacturing capacity was again maybe double global demand. Q and other price collapse. Prices fell around 42% in 2023 alone. Lots of newer players are facing losses. Vicious competition is back. It really looks like the same cycle. State push leads to expansion, leads to oversupply, leads to a shakeout, leaving a few dominant giants.
Then was it similar for wind and batteries?
Pretty much. Wind turbines? Sure. Supporting many manufacturers in the 2000s led to a glut, price wars, then consolidation around leaders like Goldwind. Batteries for EVs and storage? Same mass proliferation model. Dozens of battery makers got incentives. Consolidation happened. Who emerged on top? CATL, now the world's biggest EV battery maker, and BYD, also huge in batteries. Both got state support but had to fight through a crowded market. The outcome: China now dominates large parts of the global lithium battery supply chain.
So for green tech, the takeaway is?
The takeaway is that this 1,000 startup bloom strategy seems particularly effective in industries like solar, wind, batteries, areas where manufacturing volume is key to driving down costs. By tolerating the initial chaos, the oversupply, the consolidation battles, China effectively became the world's workshop for clean energy hardware. The price was periodic gluts and wasted capacity, sure, but the strategic payoff controlling these critical supply chains seems worth it to them.
Okay, one more sector, biotechnology. This feels like a newer frontier for this strategy. How does it apply here? Is it different because it's so R&D intensive?
It is newer and, yes, different dynamics. Historically, China really lagged in developing truly novel drugs. But over the last decade or so, they've made a huge push to build a domestic biotech sector. Same tools. State funding for R&D, regulatory reforms to speed things up, support for literally hundreds of biotech startups trying to find new drugs and therapies, and you saw a definite startup boom. Between 2010 and 2020, something like 140 new biopharma companies were launched in China, about double the number from the previous decade. This was actually happening while new biotech formation was slowing down in the West. They designated biopharma a key strategic industry, rolled out policies like faster clinical trial approvals or special biotech parks with subsidies, allowing unprofitable companies to IPO on markets like Hong Kong or Shanghai's Star Market. Plus, of course, state-backed VC funds invested heavily.
And did this create a genuinely innovative scene, or just lots of companies?
It created a very vibrant biotech startup scene, no doubt. Companies like BeiGene, Zylab, Innovative Biologics, Wuji Biologics, many founded in the 2010s, are now developing really cutting-edge stuff. Immuno-oncology, CAR-T cancer therapies, these are complex, advanced treatments. Get this, over half of the global pipeline for CAR-T cell therapies now involves a Chinese company. And you had multiple startups developing competing PD-1 cancer drugs almost simultaneously. So the government's broad support meant many parallel bets were placed across different areas: AI, drug discovery, gene editing, etc. This creates competition, but also, yes, redundancy. Weaker players did struggle to get follow-on funding in 2022, 2023, and like AI, failed biotech startups tend to just quietly vanish or get acquired, no empty factories.
And is China actually contributing to global innovation now in this field?
Definitely. Their share of global biotech venture funding shot up from about 3.5% in 2010 to around 19% by 2020. Drugs originating in China are getting approved and licensed overseas. Big multinational pharma companies are now actively partnering with Chinese biotechs. The advantage is building capacity fast. Shanghai alone reportedly has over 3,000 life science companies now. The state also helps successful startups scale up building manufacturing, running large trials.
But going back to that R&D point, in something as complex as biotech, is just having more startups enough? Is there a risk of quantity over quality, maybe lots of Me Too drugs instead of real breakthroughs?
That's the big debate, the quality versus quantity question. Just throwing dozens of perhaps inexperienced startups at incredibly complex biological problems doesn't automatically guarantee faster breakthroughs. Some analysts do point to a lot of Me Too drugs coming out of China drugs, similar to existing successful ones, rather than truly first-in-class innovations. The government seems aware of this. They're trying to steer funding towards more genuinely novel research now, and they have these tiered programs like the Little Giants Initiative to recognize and support the most innovative, smaller companies. But overall, China is rapidly catching up. They became number 2 globally in the number of clinical trials running by 2022, so their contribution is becoming significant.
Okay, so if we zoom out and connect all these dots, this 1,000 startups model China uses, it really is quite different from how innovation usually works in the West, say in the US or Europe. Each way has its own pros and cons, right? Especially regarding the role of the state.
Yeah, that's the core question, isn't it? What are the fundamental differences in how they use the state versus the market? China's state seems much more directive. Absolutely. China's model is very much state-driven and top-down when it comes to setting the direction. They deploy huge public funds, use industrial policy to push specific sectors, and bag dozens, even hundreds of firms in those areas. The U.S., in contrast, is largely market-driven and bottom-up. Innovation relies mostly on private venture capital. The government's role is more limited, mainly regulation, maybe funding basic research. The EU is maybe somewhere in between, often emphasizing stable, long-term support, regulation, maybe more collaborative projects. One analysis summed it up nicely. China focuses on rapid government-backed scaling. The EU prioritizes stable long-term support and regulation, and the U.S. relies on a venture capital ecosystem with fast funding and strong intellectual property protections.
So what are the advantages of China's way, being able to mobilize resources like that?
Big advantages. They can move fast, mobilize resources on a massive scale. They can fund things private markets might avoid really risky long-term projects. And they can align the whole country behind strategic goals, like achieving tech self-sufficiency. It seems to work particularly well when scale and speed are the name of the game, like building out EV infrastructure, battery plants. They could just leapfrog ahead in production capacity and adoption.
And the Western model, what's its strength? Efficiency. Breakthroughs.
Generally, yes. The market-driven approach tends to allocate capital more efficiently, in theory, to the ideas investors think are most likely to succeed. It avoids some of the obvious waste you see in China's approach. Western VCs are also pretty ruthless. Startups have to find a viable business model fast, or they die. That arguably creates a sharper competitive edge.
Right.
And historically, the Western system has been better at generating truly radical breakthrough innovation. maybe because it's less directed from the top, allowing more unexpected ideas to bubble up.
What about just the sheer number of startups? You mentioned 500 EV makers in China versus maybe a handful in the West. What does that massive difference mean strategically?
Strategically, it means a much higher fertility rate for companies and ideas in China, at least initially. Just mathematically, more startups mean more chances to find a winner. It also helps create a whole domestic market very quickly. Chinese consumers suddenly had tons of EV models to choose from, which spurred adoption. And all that intense competition between so many players drives costs down really fast. The volume itself builds an ecosystem.
But the downside of that scale must be quality control, redundancy.
Exactly. Redundancy is built in. And the average quality can be lower, especially early on. If lots of startups are just chasing subsidies, they might not be truly innovative. This leads to that pattern of boom, bust, wasted capital, ghost factories.
And the funding itself. You mentioned state-backed VCs. How does that compare to private VC in the West? Is it just more patient capital?
It's definitely more patient and often more risk-tolerant if it serves a national goal. By some estimates, government or state-owned sources made up over 35% of VC funding in China by 2016. That's huge. That ample risk capital is a big advantage for China. They can sustain efforts in really tough, expensive fields like chips or biotech without demanding quick profits. But the disadvantage, it can create moral hazard. You get zombie companies kept alive by subsidies. There's also more risk of corruption or favoritism in state funding allocation. Private VC, for all its flaws, is usually pretty unsentimental about backing winners and cutting losers based on potential returns.
How does the weeding out process differ? In China, does the state step in to manage the consolidation?
It seems so. Market forces play a role eventually, but the process is often heavily guided. The state might suddenly cut subsidies for an entire sector when it thinks there's too much capacity, forcing a shakeout. They can also actively orchestrate mergers or even force companies to close. In the West, it's usually much more organic. Companies fail or succeed based purely on market dynamics. The advantage for China's way is that policy tools can speed up the consolidation, steer their winning process towards the desired outcome. And once winners emerge, the state can then shower them with support. The risk, though, is that this picking winners might entrench politically connected firms, reduce competition too soon, and potentially stifle innovation in the longer run.
And finally, what about the overall culture? Does this top-down approach shape the innovation culture itself?
Definitely. China's approach fosters a very mission-oriented culture. Entrepreneurs, researchers, investors. They often know the national priorities and align with them. Talent gets channeled quickly into targeted fields. The West is generally more decentralized and exploratory. People pursue a wider range of ideas, less constrained by government directives. Europe often adds an emphasis on sustainable and regulated innovation. The potential downside for China's culture is that strong top-down guidance might sometimes stifle originality. Historically, they've been seen as weaker in basic research and truly novel ideas, although, as we noted, that's changing fast. And the domestic focus can create challenges when companies try to go global. Which brings up a really critical point. Okay, so China's system creates these winners, these national champions. But what happens then? How does the state maintain control or influence over these now powerful companies?
Right. Western governments regulate, obviously, but it feels like China takes a much more direct role with its leading firms. What does that heavier hand actually involve?
It's a very different philosophy. Beijing has become much more assertive, especially under Xi Jinping, in emphasizing that the party leads everything. The CCC actively embeds itself within businesses to ensure they stay aligned with state goals. This is quite unlike the Western model of regulating at arm's length through laws, antitrust actions, etc., without getting directly involved in how companies are run day to day. Think about the tech crackdown that started around 2020, 2021, halting Ant Group's massive IPO, hitting companies with huge fines. It wiped over $1 trillion off market caps. That sent a clear message. The party is in charge, and companies need to toe the line.
Okay, so how do they exert that control? What are the actual mechanisms?
There are several key mechanisms. First, state ownership stakes. The government often keeps or takes equity stakes. Sometimes these are small, almost symbolic golden shares, like a 1% stake in an Alibaba media unit that give the state disproportionate power, like board seats or veto rights over key decisions, especially around content or data. It's influence without full nationalization.
Golden shares. Interesting. What else?
Second, CCP party committees. Chinese law requires companies over a certain size to host Communist Party organizations internally. Under Xi, these party committees have been strengthened. They're often written right into company charters. Their role is internal oversight, making sure decisions align with party directives. Even huge private tech firms like Alibaba, Tencent, Huawei, they all have active party cells inside them. An FBI report even noted Huawei likely has legal obligations to act for the state via its internal CCP committee. So the party is